Okay, my friends, I wanted to record a little something to cover the part of the lecture that got cut off. Well, it didn't get cut off, but I had no sound when I was recording, so I apologize for that. Talking specifically about this bottom part of the study guide, skeletal muscle contractions, the muscle responses, and the actions of those muscles. So we'll start with the neuromuscular junction, where the nerve is coming into the muscle. And we learned about this when we studied about the Botox. And the point being is that when the signal comes down the nerve to tell the muscle to fire, the nerve is not actually touching the muscle. There's this gap, this synaptic cleft. And so these little vesicles, the synaptic vesicles, have acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, not translator, transmitter, that is then taken across that cleft to go into the muscle and basically tell the muscle, hey, you need to fire. And that neurotransmitter signal then gets sent through the muscle fibers to get each of these sarcomeres to begin to fire. So that's the connection between the nervous system and the muscular system. The nervous system controls how the muscular system fires. And the contraction of the skeletal muscle uses what we call the sliding filament theory. And the point of that is that we have these thick myosin and the thin actins that make up each of these little sarcomere pieces. This is zoomed in much closer than that. And on those myosins, they have these little cross bridges that are looking to bind up onto these actin filaments. So there are two proteins there, tropomyosin and troponin. And when those bonding sites are opened, calcium comes and they open them up. Here's the picture that's in your textbook on page 194. When the calcium comes and it exposes those binding sites, these cross bridges reach up and grab that. Okay, there's a bond that happens between those cross bridge ends and on the myosin and the actin pieces up on the top. When that bond happens, then ATP is used to actually bend that cross bridge. And when that happens, we're taking it from its resting, relaxed state, and we're shortening, we're moving these two Z lines closer together. So this is a partially contracting. And here's a fully contracted. So by bending that, that takes energy. We call that the power stroke. New ATP comes to release these cross bridges from that binding site. And then the ATP is used to actually reset the cross bridge to cock them into the position so that they can again reach up, grab a new site, do that power stroke, bend, and shorten the fiber. So this is how the muscle actually contracts. And each one of these sarcomeres, because this one piece here is a sarcomere, each one of those is contained in all these muscles. And again, remember back to this original picture of how this guy works, that each of those myofibrils makes up a muscle fiber, and each of those muscle fibers makes up this fascicle, and a bunch of those fascicles make up a muscle. So all those little shortening pieces add up to the muscle itself, shortening. So in order for us to do this shortening, we have to have ATP, right? You must have energy to do that. And of course, the energy is made in that process of cellular respiration that we learned a couple of units ago, where glucose is broken down. And normally that happens in the presence of oxygen. That's where we get those 32 to 34 ATPs that are produced, right, from one molecule of glucose. Well, that can also happen without oxygen. If you have oxygen present, it's stored in the myoglobin there in the, which is like hemoglobin in the blood cells, but this is actually in the muscle tissue, so because we use so much oxygen in the muscles. But if we don't have enough of that oxygen, which happens if you're exercising for more than a couple of minutes, your body starts to burn the glucose without oxygen. And that will lead to what we call oxygen debt or oxygen deficiency. The product of that, remember when we have oxygen present, the product is carbon dioxide, right? Which we breathe out through our exhale. But when you are doing it without oxygen, you now have lactic acid that builds up. That's the product of anaerobic respiration. And that lactic acid builds up in the muscles, and that's what makes you sore after you've worked out really hard, because you've actually gone into the anaerobic phase. Your muscles have been burning glucose without oxygen, and so therefore this lactic acid is the product of that. If you do that for too long, you run into what we call oxygen debt, and that means you have this lactic acid that is built up, and your liver has to take that lactic acid and convert it into glucose to get rid of it, basically, to resynthesize ATP. So that way we can get your muscles back ready to work efficiently. And that oxygen debt may take hours or even days if you're really working hard to reset the muscles so that they can work normally. Muscle fatigue is a very common thing that happens when you are, sorry, I went too far here, when you're exercising. Nope. Still not far enough. There we go. And again, that's just the muscle losing its ability to contract because it has used up its normal storage of oxygen. And so now we're starting to build up this lactic acid, and that actually prevents the muscles from contracting. A muscle cramp can happen where that muscle just spasms and tightens and it won't let go if I don't have enough ATP to reset those muscle fibers. So that's where you get these pieces just not working as well. Sorry, I got to take this call. Okay, my apologies. So I think we're comfortable with muscle fatigue, how that happens. Let's talk briefly about muscular responses, this threshold stimulus that we do need for there to actually reach a point where the muscle responds to the stimulus from the nerve, and that is what we call the threshold stimulus. I think of it this way. Imagine me sitting here and punching your shoulder, but just very small punches. But if I keep punching you for a long period of time and keep getting harder and keep getting harder and keep getting harder and keep getting harder, eventually you are going to respond, whether it's telling me to stop, whether it's telling your parents, whether it's decking me with your own fist. You have reached the threshold where you are finally actually going to react, to do something. Before that, you were unresponsive, below that threshold. But once we finally got over that threshold, now you do something. Muscles are the same way. They won't actually contract until there's enough strength of a stimulation from the nerve to say, hey, contract. And once they do that, then the whole thing reacts. It's an all or nothing response. Not only part of the muscle, all of the muscle contracts. So that's threshold stimulus. On the study guide, at the very top, it talked about smooth muscles and cardiac muscles, some differences between them. In the PowerPoint, there are some slides here that talk about smooth muscles and what they look like and how they contract. You're welcome to check those out. The point simply is that I want you to know the differences, that smooth muscles are not striated, they are not voluntary, that cardiac muscles have the striations, but they also have this intercalated discs. Sorry, that's down one more. Intercalated discs, and these guys can contract for longer periods of time with much less rest. They're also self-contracting. There's a piece of the heart that actually makes it contract, and the brain doesn't even have much involvement at all. And certainly you cannot consciously control that, whereas in skeletal muscles you can consciously control it. So let's last talk about the skeletal muscle actions. So you have an origin and an insertion. Origin is where the muscle starts, insertion is where it goes to. The movable end is called the insertion. The immovable, the one that stays the same, is the origin. So if we look here at this biceps, the origin of the biceps is two places, on the coracoid process of the scapula, as well as onto the glenoid cavity where the ball of the humerus, the head of the humerus, is attaching to that scapula. Those are the origins. They stay still. The insertion is down here on the radius. Actually, this is called the radial tuberosity, this little piece right there. So this piece moves toward the origins when the biceps shortens. If this moves toward that, it bends the elbow into this elbow flexion. The muscle that does that primary motion, that does the majority of the work, is what we call the prime mover. So in your elbow flexion, the prime mover you would think is the biceps. One of the synergists that help that is the brachialis. It's underneath that muscle. It's not pictured here, but it would be underneath here like this, doing the same motion as the biceps, helping it along. That's what we call a synergist. The muscle that does the opposite is what we call an antagonist. That would be, in the case for the biceps, that would be the triceps, which run on the back side of the upper arm, and that extends the elbow. So we have origin insertion. The prime mover is also called the agonist. That's an older word. Synergist is a helper. Antagonist is doing the opposite. So another classic example would be your hamstrings on the back here, your biceps femoris, your semitendinosus, semimembranosus. Those would be doing knee flexion, bending your knee up, your heel toward your bottom. And the antagonist for that would be your quadriceps, the rectus femoris, the vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and the vastus intermedius underneath there. And muscles always work in pairs like this because we want to straighten your leg and we want to bend your leg. You do both of those things. I think that catches us up with what we needed to have recorded. I hope you'll find that helpful.